Number 1. Stephen Craig Paddock. The first important fact about Stephen Paddock is also one of the strangest. There was no long public trail of ideological violence leading toward the night of October 1, 2017. There was no manifesto publicly circulating beforehand, no known terrorist organization behind him, and no established history that allowed investigators to say, with confidence, that they had been watching a dangerous man approach a particular target. Instead, Paddock had spent much of his adult life moving through ordinary environments. He worked in accounting and real estate. He gambled, he traveled, he lived privately. He maintained relationships, including one with Marilou Danley. And by the time investigators began reconstructing his final years, they were confronted with a problem that would define the entire case. The man who had carried out the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history had not left behind one clear explanation for why he did it. On the evening of October 1, thousands of people were gathered at the Route 91 Harvest Festival in Las Vegas. From the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, Paddock opened fire into the crowd. The shooting lasted approximately 11 minutes. More than 1,000 rounds were fired. 58 people were killed during the attack, with 2 additional victims later dying from injuries, bringing the eventual death toll to 60. More than 400 people were wounded by gunfire, while many others were injured during the chaos of the evacuation. The scale of the attack was immediately obvious. The explanation for it was not. That distinction matters because Paddock's story is not simply one of a man who suddenly became violent. It is a case about how difficult it can be to interpret behavior before the meaning of that behavior becomes visible. Paddock was born in 1953. His father, Benjamin Paddock, had been a bank robber and fugitive who appeared on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. But the existence of that family history does not provide a simple explanation for Stephen Paddock's later actions. His adult life developed along a very different path. He became financially successful. He invested in property. He spent significant amounts of time gambling. He was described by people who knew him as private, and in many respects difficult to read. That privacy would become important later. The FBI's Las Vegas review panel eventually spent nearly a year analyzing the available evidence surrounding Paddock's development, relationships, clinical history, behavior, and preparations. The panel did not find evidence that the attack had been motivated by an ideological or political agenda. It also found no evidence that Paddock had conspired with another person or organization. Most importantly, investigators concluded that there was no single or clear motivating factor. That finding leaves an uncomfortable question. If there was no single motive, what were investigators supposed to have recognized beforehand? Paddock's life contained fragments. There were financial concerns. There were interpersonal issues. There were behavioral changes. There were indications of increasing isolation. There were preparations that only became unmistakable when investigators looked backward. And that is where the case becomes forensic rather than merely sensational. Paddock did not simply arrive in Las Vegas carrying a weapon and begin firing. He rented rooms. He accumulated firearms. He transported equipment. He selected a location overlooking a large public gathering. He brought weapons and ammunition into the hotel. He prepared the room. He created firing positions. Some of those preparations were visible only in retrospect. The hotel itself became a crucial part of the investigation because the attack demonstrated how an ordinary commercial environment could be transformed into a vantage point for mass violence. Before the shooting, Paddock had stayed at the Mandalay Bay property more than once. He was familiar with Las Vegas. He understood hotels. He understood gambling environments. He understood the physical geography of the city. But familiarity is not the same thing as suspicion. A man booking a hotel room in Las Vegas does not automatically appear dangerous. A wealthy gambler possessing firearms does not automatically appear to be planning a mass shooting. A private person who travels frequently does not necessarily trigger a law enforcement response. The problem investigators faced after October 1 was therefore not simply identifying what Paddock had done. It was determining which ordinary behaviors had actually been warning signs. Keep that distinction in mind, because it becomes far more important when the rest of his preparations are reconstructed. On the day of the festival, the city was functioning normally. The Route 91 Harvest Festival occupied an open-air venue across from the Mandalay Bay. Thousands of people were there for music. From Paddock's room, the crowd was visible. At approximately 10:05 p.m., the first shots were fired. At first, people did not understand what they were hearing. A concert environment is already loud. The sound of music, crowd noise, fireworks, and amplified equipment can make it difficult to identify the source of sudden noise. Then people began to fall. The attack continued. Police officers moved toward the Mandalay Bay. Security personnel attempted to determine where the gunfire was coming from. Inside the hotel, officers searched for the source. The situation developed faster than the information available to those responding. There was no conventional gunman standing in the crowd. The attacker was above them. That physical separation created another problem. The officers responding to the scene had to locate the correct floor and room while the shooting was continuing. As law enforcement personnel assembled outside Paddock's room, the shooting stopped. Paddock had killed himself. The first investigation, therefore, began with an unusual fact. The suspect was already dead. There would be no interrogation, no confession in court. No opportunity for investigators to confront him with the evidence and ask him to explain what he had done. The explanation had to be reconstructed from his life. Investigators examined his movements. They examined his financial activity. They examined communications. They examined his possessions. They examined his relationships. They examined his medical and psychological history. They looked at what he had purchased and what he had prepared. They examined what he had said. They examined what he had not said. The FBI review ultimately concluded that Paddock acted alone and that no single clear motive could explain the attack. That conclusion is important because true crime narratives often search for one decisive moment, one betrayal, one diagnosis, one political belief, one grievance, one sentence, one event. The Paddock investigation did not produce such a clean answer. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a complex convergence of factors. That makes the case less satisfying but more accurate. Paddock's preparation also demonstrated something investigators could only fully appreciate after the fact. Preparation does not always resemble conventional criminal behavior. There was no bank being robbed, no hostage negotiation, no public threat, no escalating series of attacks that automatically announced the next one. There was a man quietly accumulating the means for an attack. That silence was part of the danger. When investigators reconstructed his final period, they found evidence that he had taken extensive steps to prepare. The hotel room contained a large number of firearms, and the FBI later documented that he had access to dozens of weapons there. Yet the presence of firearms alone could not explain the attack. The United States contains millions of gun owners. Las Vegas contains enormous numbers of hotel guests. The difficult question was never whether Paddock possessed weapons. It was whether the combination of his behavior, his purchases, his travel, his relationships, and his preparation formed a recognizable threat. Before October 1, nobody had assembled those pieces into that picture. After October 1, the pieces were impossible to ignore. That is the forensic contradiction at the center of the case. The evidence was there, but evidence is not the same thing as warning. For a warning to work, someone has to recognize the pattern before the event occurs. Paddock's behavior remained fragmented. He was not publicly known as a violent extremist. The FBI's later assessment found no ideological motivation. He did not announce an intention to carry out an attack, and there was no evidence of a conspiracy that could have produced an external warning. The attack, therefore, arrived with extraordinary force and surprisingly little visible narrative. That does not mean it was literally unforeseeable. It means that, based on the available evidence, investigators did not have a clear and actionable picture of what Paddock was preparing to do. The distinction is crucial. After the shooting, the hotel became an enormous crime scene. The room had to be documented. Weapons had to be cataloged. Ballistic evidence had to be analyzed. Paddock's movements had to be reconstructed. His computers and electronic devices had to be examined. His financial records had to be traced. His relationships had to be revisited. Investigators had to ask questions of people who had known him for years. What had they noticed? What had they dismissed? Had his behavior changed? Had he expressed anger? Had he become isolated? Had he shown signs of instability? And if he had, were those signs specific enough to indicate an impending mass attack? The answers remained complicated. The FBI review panel found that Paddock's motivations appeared to involve a combination of developmental, interpersonal, clinical, and contextual factors rather than one identifiable cause. That finding also changed the way the case could be understood. Paddock was not a conventional ideological terrorist. He was not a serial killer whose pattern had been building through repeated murders. He was not a fugitive who had spent years running from police. He was a man whose violent trajectory remained largely private until its final expression. The night ended with his death, but the investigation continued for months. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed his life in detail, attempting to understand not simply what he had done, but what behaviors had preceded it. That distinction matters because prevention depends on the period before the crime. Once the crime has happened, almost everything becomes clearer. The weapons are evidence. The hotel room is evidence. The purchases are evidence. The movements are evidence. The final actions are evidence. But before the crime, each of those elements exists separately. One purchase, one hotel booking, one conversation, one behavioral change, one private grievance. The danger lies in the fact that ordinary life produces countless such fragments. Only occasionally do they form a recognizable pattern. Paddock's case remains disturbing precisely because investigators were forced to build that pattern after the fact. He had not been stopped. He had not been arrested. He had not been publicly identified as a dangerous individual. He reached the final stage of his preparation without an intervention that prevented the attack, and then in 11 minutes the fragments became a catastrophe. The FBI later concluded that there was no single clear motive and that Paddock acted alone. There is a certain finality in that conclusion. It closes the question of conspiracy. It narrows the question of ideology. But it does not completely answer the question of why, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the case. Sometimes the investigation does not end with a sentence that explains everything. Sometimes it ends with a collection of facts that explain enough to establish what happened, while leaving the deepest motive partly unresolved. Paddock's story began with privacy. It ended with an attack witnessed by thousands. Between those 2 points was a period in which behavior changed, preparations accumulated, and no one assembled the evidence into a prediction. The tragedy cannot be reduced to the idea that police simply missed an obvious clue. The official investigation found something more complicated. A man whose behavior contained potential warning signs, but whose final motive and intended attack were not clearly communicated to anyone capable of stopping him. That is why the case remains so difficult to interpret. The warning was not a single alarm. It was a scattered collection of details, and scattered details are hardest to recognize before they become evidence. Number 2. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy's crimes became notorious partly because of their scale, but the deeper forensic problem was the amount of ordinary behavior surrounding them. He could speak calmly. He could appear educated. He could build relationships. He could move between states. He could manipulate people who had no reason, at first glance, to believe they were standing near a dangerous offender. The first signs of the criminal he would become did not arrive with the image that later attached itself to his name. Bundy was born in Vermont in 1946 and grew up in circumstances that were complicated by uncertainty about his parentage and family relationships. As a young man, he pursued education and developed a socially conventional identity. He studied. He dated. He became politically involved. He appeared ambitious. He cultivated relationships. None of those things prevented him from eventually becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers. The contrast is important because Bundy's crimes depended heavily on his ability to manipulate appearances. In Washington state during the 1970s, young women began disappearing. The cases did not initially present themselves as one unified series. Different locations, different victims, different circumstances, different investigative agencies. Bundy benefited from that fragmentation. He also benefited from the difficulty of recognizing a serial offender when the individual cases were still being treated separately. His methods varied, but he frequently relied on deception and an appearance of vulnerability or normality. In some documented encounters, he presented himself as injured or in need of assistance. That simple manipulation was powerful because it exploited a social expectation. People tend to help someone who appears to need help. Investigators eventually began connecting cases. Bundy, meanwhile, moved. He crossed state lines. The geography of the United States worked in his favor. A suspect who disappeared from one jurisdiction could become another state's problem. A crime committed in Washington could become a case in Utah. Evidence did not automatically travel as quickly as the offender, and the technology available to investigators in the 1970s was vastly more limited than what modern forensic teams possess. The eventual investigation began to accumulate details, witness descriptions, vehicle information, statements, physical evidence, patterns of disappearance. The name Ted Bundy gradually became associated with some of those cases, but recognition did not immediately produce capture. Bundy was arrested in Utah in 1975 after a traffic stop led to the discovery of suspicious items in his vehicle. That arrest marked an important turning point because investigators now had a living suspect to examine. He was eventually charged and convicted in Utah for aggravated kidnapping. Yet the case was far from finished. Bundy escaped custody twice. The first escape occurred in 1977 when he jumped from a courthouse window in Colorado. He was recaptured. Then, on December 30th, 1977, he escaped again. This time, he disappeared for weeks. The second escape was more consequential. Bundy traveled to Florida. In January 1978, he attacked at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, killing 2 women and seriously assaulting others. A few weeks later, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from Lake City. Bundy was eventually arrested in Pensacola after a police officer stopped the Volkswagen he was driving. The irony was stark. After years of deception, interstate movement, and escapes, the final arrest came from a relatively ordinary police encounter. His vehicle had stolen plates. The officer did not know the full identity of the man he had stopped. Bundy did. That moment illustrates one of the central characteristics of his criminal career. His greatest protection was not invisibility, it was uncertainty. He could be noticed without being understood. He could be suspected without being connected to every case. He could be arrested without investigators, yet knowing the full scope of what they were dealing with. Once Bundy reached trial, however, the public image changed. The charismatic law student persona became part of the story because it contrasted so sharply with the evidence. He represented himself during portions of his Florida proceedings. The courtroom became another environment in which he attempted to control perception. But evidence is less responsive to charm than people are. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders, and later convicted of Kimberly Leach's murder. He received death sentences. Bundy continued to deny or manipulate aspects of his criminal history for years. Near the end of his life, however, he made admissions concerning numerous killings. He was executed in Florida on January 24, 1989. The exact number of his victims remains uncertain, although Bundy confessed to 30 murders. That uncertainty is itself part of the historical record. A criminal can leave behind evidence of what he did without leaving behind a complete account of everything he did. Bundy's case, therefore, remains less a story about one hidden clue than about accumulated failures of recognition. He was able to move because jurisdictions were separated. He was able to manipulate because witnesses were human. He was able to escape because security systems were imperfect. And he was able to delay the full understanding of his crimes because investigators had to build the case piece by piece. The important forensic lesson is not that Bundy was some supernatural criminal who could not be stopped. He made mistakes. He left evidence. He was arrested. He was identified. He was convicted. The frightening part is how long those mistakes could coexist with continued freedom. Keep that detail in mind, because the next case presents a different version of the same problem. Not a man who crossed state lines while appearing ordinary, but a man who built an entire respectable identity around the crimes hidden underneath it. Number 3. John Wayne Gacy. By the time police understood the scale of John Wayne Gacy's crimes, they were no longer investigating a suspicious outsider. They were investigating a man who had spent years constructing an identity that appeared almost aggressively ordinary. Gacy was a businessman. He operated a contracting company. He was married. He participated in community events. He was involved in Democratic Party politics. He sometimes performed as a clown at charitable events and children's functions. People knew him as Pogo. That nickname became grotesquely ironic only after investigators discovered what was buried beneath the image. Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942 and grew up in a troubled family environment. His relationship with his father was difficult and he experienced serious health problems as a child. His adult life initially moved through conventional milestones: marriage, employment, business, community involvement. But there were also criminal episodes before the murders for which he ultimately became infamous. In 1968, Gacy was convicted in Iowa of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served part of his sentence and was released in 1970. That conviction should have been significant. Instead, Gacy rebuilt his life in Illinois. He established himself in Norwood Park Township. He ran PDM contractors. He became socially active. He cultivated relationships with local politicians. He presented himself as a responsible businessman. And beneath that public identity, he began murdering young men and boys. The precise beginning of his murder series is difficult to establish because the early crimes were not immediately connected. The first known victim in the period generally associated with his murders was Timothy McCoy, killed in 1972. Other disappearances followed. Many victims were young men who had been recruited for work, approached socially, or encountered Gacy in circumstances that did not immediately appear dangerous. That distinction is important. Gacy did not need to look like a monster. He needed to look believable. His house became central to the eventual investigation. The address was 823 West Summerdale Avenue. For years, it was simply the home of a contractor. Neighbors saw activity. Workers came and went. The property looked like a residence. Nothing about the exterior announced what investigators would eventually find. By the late 1970s, however, disappearances had begun to accumulate. One of the crucial cases involved 15-year-old Robert Piest. In December 1978, Piest disappeared after telling his mother that a contractor had offered him a job. That contractor was Gacy. Police began investigating. Unlike earlier disappearances, this case created a direct investigative path from a missing teenager to a specific adult. Gacy was questioned. His movements were examined. Police obtained warrants. Investigators began searching his property. The case had changed. For years, Gacy had benefited from the fact that each disappearance existed as a separate mystery. Now investigators had a name. They had a house. They had a connection to the missing boy. They had evidence. And the house began to give up its secrets. Searches uncovered human remains. The investigation rapidly expanded. The property was excavated. Bodies were discovered beneath the house and elsewhere on the property. The scale was staggering. Gacy had hidden victims in spaces directly beneath his ordinary domestic life. This is where the forensic contradiction becomes especially disturbing. The same structure in which he entertained people, ran his business, and maintained a conventional identity had become the center of a murder site. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. The investigation did not end with the arrest because police still had to identify the dead. Many victims were unknown. Families had been waiting for answers. Missing person cases had to be revisited. Records had to be compared. The work became both criminal and forensic. Gacy eventually confessed to numerous killings, though his statements varied and sometimes contradicted established evidence. He was charged with multiple murders. His trial began in 1980. The prosecution presented extensive evidence. The defense attempted to challenge the state's case and Gacy's mental responsibility. He was convicted of 33 murders. He was sentenced to death. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the convictions, and after years on death row, Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. The case left behind an important lesson about visibility. Gacy was not invisible. He was visible in many ways. He was a businessman, a neighbor, a political volunteer, a husband, a contractor, a person who interacted with members of his community. The problem was that the visible identity did not reveal the hidden behavior, and there had been earlier warning signs. His 1968 conviction demonstrated that authorities already had evidence of serious sexual misconduct. Yet after his release, he was able to reconstruct a respectable life. That does not mean the later murders were predictable in every detail. It means the history complicates the idea that Gacy emerged from nowhere. The criminal record existed, the behavioral history existed, the missing persons existed. What did not exist was a single system capable of joining every fragment before the final investigation. Robert Piest's disappearance changed that. The teenager's connection to Gacy provided investigators with the bridge that earlier cases had lacked. Once police crossed that bridge, the ordinary house became a crime scene. The public image collapsed. The businessman became a defendant. The clown became evidence. The basement and crawl spaces became part of a forensic record, and a community that had known Gacy as a familiar local figure had to confront a radically different reality. The significance of the case is not that a killer somehow fooled everyone perfectly. He did not. There were clues. There were prior offenses. There were suspicious circumstances. There were missing young men. But the clues remained disconnected until one disappearance created the investigative pressure necessary to connect them. That is often how long-running criminal cases end, not with a magical breakthrough, with one case becoming impossible to ignore. Number 4. Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, the man who became known as the Golden State Killer existed inside the lives of ordinary people, without being recognized as the offender police were seeking. The crimes began in California in the 1970s. They continued into the 1980s. Then the trail went cold. For years, investigators had evidence. They had DNA. They had witness descriptions. They had crime scenes. They had patterns. What they did not have was a name. Joseph DeAngelo had meanwhile continued living. He married. He raised a family. He worked as a police officer before later retiring. He lived in communities where neighbors could encounter him, without knowing what investigators had spent decades trying to discover. The irony was severe. A former police officer was eventually identified as the man behind a crime series that had consumed police departments across California. The offender had been close to the world of law enforcement itself. The crimes began in the Sacramento area during the 1970s and later spread across other California jurisdictions. The offender initially became known through different names because investigators were dealing with what appeared to be separate series. He was called the East Area Rapist in the Sacramento region. Later, crimes in other parts of California were associated with the original Night Stalker. The fragmentation mattered. Different jurisdictions investigated different crimes. Different task forces developed different theories, but the same offender was moving through the system. The attacks were characterized by careful planning and repeated behavioral patterns. He stalked homes. He selected targets. He entered at night. He committed sexual assaults. Later, he murdered victims. The progression made the case especially disturbing because investigators were not dealing with random violence. They were dealing with a repeated offender whose behavior evolved. Yet for years, there was no arrest. DNA eventually became one of the most important elements in the case. Investigators could link crimes biologically without knowing the perpetrator's identity. That created an unusual situation. They knew they were dealing with the same man. They simply did not know who he was. Decades passed, the technology changed. Investigators revisited old evidence. The case entered a new era when law enforcement used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect. In 2018, investigators arrested Joseph DeAngelo. He was 72 years old. The arrest transformed the case overnight. The man investigators had spent decades searching for was no longer a mysterious figure moving through old crime reports. He had an address, a family history, employment records, a driver's license, a life, and a name. The evidence against him was extensive. DNA comparisons linked him to crimes. Investigators also reconstructed his movements and history. The case exposed the extraordinary value of preserving biological evidence. Without that evidence, D'Angelo might have remained unidentified. With it, technological advances eventually converted an anonymous DNA profile into a human identity. D'Angelo pleaded guilty in 2020 to 13 murders and admitted numerous additional crimes. He received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The significance of his case lies partly in the time span. A person who committed crimes in the 1970s could still be living in the same society decades later when science finally caught up with him. During that period, investigators changed. Police departments changed. Technology changed. DNA databases expanded, but the evidence remained. That is what makes the Golden State Killer case different from many older investigations. The clue did not disappear, it waited. D'Angelo's arrest also demonstrated the importance of separating public appearance from criminal history. There was no public identity called Golden State Killer attached to D'Angelo's daily life. The name existed only in investigative files. To his neighbors, he was simply Joseph D'Angelo. The two identities occupied the same physical world. One was known to investigators as a dangerous unknown offender. The other was known to the people around him as a private older man. The eventual prosecution removed that separation. The past became present. The crimes were no longer unsolved historical events. They had an identified perpetrator. For victims and surviving families, the arrest did not erase decades of damage. But it changed the status of the case. For investigators, it demonstrated something that had been almost impossible to imagine during the early years. A case could remain alive for decades if the evidence survived. The offender did not need to make a confession. He did not need to return to the crime scene. He did not need to contact police. Science could eventually return to him. That is the quiet power of forensic evidence. It does not need to know who you are. It only needs to preserve the fact that you were there. Number 5. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader spent years constructing an ordinary life while secretly maintaining an identity that revolved around murder. He was a husband, a father, a church member, a municipal employee. He worked in public-facing environments. He interacted with neighbors. He lived in Kansas, and for decades he believed he could keep two versions of himself separate. One was Dennis Rader, the other was BTK. The name came from his own description of what he did: bind, torture, kill. The first known murders occurred in 1974 when Rader killed members of the Otero family in Wichita. The crimes shocked the community. Rader then communicated with the media and police. That behavior became one of the defining features of the case. He wanted recognition. He wanted control over the narrative. But after the initial murders, the killings stopped for long periods. That created an investigative problem. A serial killer who disappears is difficult to track. There is no active crime scene, no new victim, no fresh pattern. No immediate forensic development. Rader remained in Wichita while the case gradually receded from daily public attention. But he did not forget. Years later, he resumed communication. He sent letters and packages to media outlets and law enforcement. The case became active again. Investigators were dealing with an offender who appeared to want both anonymity and attention. That contradiction eventually became one of the weaknesses in his strategy. Rader believed he was controlling the communication. He was not. Investigators examined the material he sent. They analyzed digital evidence. They studied the metadata associated with a computer disk. Rader had asked police whether they could trace a floppy disk. He was told, through a television response, that the department could not. He believed that answer. He sent a disk. Investigators recovered information from it that pointed toward a church. A church leader's name was associated with the metadata. That name led investigators toward Rader. The man who had spent decades keeping his two identities separate had accidentally connected them. Police began surveillance. They obtained DNA evidence. The case closed. Rader was arrested in February 2005. He confessed. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He received 10 consecutive life sentences. The BTK case is an unusually clear demonstration of how an offender's own need for recognition can become a vulnerability. Rader had not been caught because someone happened to see him commit a murder. He had not been identified through a dramatic chase. He had been caught because he wanted to communicate. The very behavior that gave him psychological satisfaction created the trail that investigators needed. His public life also made the case particularly disturbing. Rader did not live as an obvious fugitive. He lived inside the community. He attended church. He worked. He raised children. He performed ordinary routines. The danger was not hidden because the man disappeared. It was hidden because the man remained. That distinction is essential. Rader's case lasted decades because his criminal identity existed alongside his ordinary identity. The people around him were not necessarily confronted with a visibly dangerous man. They were confronted with the person he chose to show them. His arrest, therefore, did more than solve a series of murders. It exposed the enormous difference between biography and behavior. A person can possess a stable job, family, religious involvement, and community reputation, while also concealing serious criminal behavior. None of those conventional markers can by themselves prove innocence or guilt. The evidence had to come from the crimes. In Rader's case, the evidence eventually converged because he reopened the conversation, and once he did, investigators were ready. Number 6. Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski's criminal identity was built around an idea. That fact made his case different from offenders driven primarily by personal relationships, sexual compulsion, or immediate anger. Kaczynski believed he had identified a fundamental problem with modern technological society. He wanted the world to understand his argument, and he was willing to kill to force that argument into public consciousness. Born in Chicago in 1942, Kaczynski was academically gifted from a young age. He entered Harvard at 16. He later earned advanced degrees in mathematics at the University of Michigan. He became a mathematics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. On paper, the trajectory looked extraordinary. Then he withdrew. Kaczynski left his academic career and eventually moved to a remote cabin in Montana. There, he developed an increasingly radical opposition to industrial society and technology. Beginning in 1978, he sent homemade bombs to universities, airlines, and other targets. The attacks continued for years. Investigators struggled to identify the bomber. The devices were crude compared with modern technology, but the offender was methodical. He used mail. He selected targets connected to institutions he opposed. He changed tactics over time. 3 people were killed. Many others were injured. The FBI opened an investigation known as Unabomb. The name came from the types of targets initially involved: university and airline bombing. For years, investigators had no confirmed identity. The case became one of the longest and most expensive investigations in FBI history. Then Kaczynski made a decision that would eventually lead to him. He demanded publication of his manifesto. The text outlined his ideological beliefs and attacked industrial society. Investigators agreed to publication. The document was printed in 1995. Kaczynski believed it would communicate his ideas. Instead, it gave investigators another kind of evidence. His brother, David Kaczynski, recognized the writing style. He became concerned that the author might be Ted. David contacted authorities. Investigators compared the manifesto with earlier writings. Linguistic similarities became significant. The investigation shifted toward Kaczynski. The FBI obtained a search warrant. In April 1996, agents arrested him at his cabin in Montana. Inside, investigators found extensive evidence connecting him to the bombing campaign, including bomb components and writings. The mysterious Unabomber had become a person. The arrest ended nearly 2 decades of attacks. Kaczynski eventually pleaded guilty in 1998 to multiple federal charges. He received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of release. The case demonstrates a different kind of forensic reversal. Kaczynski's weapon was not simply the bomb, it was also language. He wanted investigators and the public to read his argument. The need to be understood created a vulnerability. His brother's recognition of his writing was the human bridge. The linguistic evidence was the analytical bridge, and the cabin became the physical bridge connecting the anonymous bomber to the man behind the attacks. Kaczynski spent years trying to remain physically separate from society, yet he could not remain psychologically separate from the need to communicate. That contradiction became decisive. The investigation did not defeat him because investigators understood his philosophy better than he did. They defeated him because his philosophy had a recognizable author. The case, therefore, illustrates an important principle in criminal investigations. A perpetrator can conceal location, he can conceal appearance, he can conceal movement, but every repeated act produces patterns. Sometimes the pattern is biological, sometimes behavioral, sometimes financial, and sometimes it is linguistic. Kaczynski left his signature in the words he chose. Once those words were connected to a person, the cabin was no longer anonymous. Number 7. David Berkowitz. In the summer of 1976, New York City began experiencing a terrifying series of shootings. The attacker appeared to strike unpredictably. Young people were targeted. The shootings happened at night. The city began to feel as though danger could emerge anywhere. The offender became known as the Son of Sam. David Berkowitz had started his criminal life long before the shootings, including incidents involving arson and other offenses. He had also experienced a difficult personal history and reported feelings of isolation and anger. But the shootings transformed him into a national obsession. His first known murder occurred in July 1976, when Donna Loria was killed and another woman, Jody Valenti, was wounded. More attacks followed. Berkowitz used a handgun. The victims were often sitting in cars. The pattern created fear because the attacks appeared random. Police faced enormous pressure. The media intensified the attention. Letters attributed to the killer became part of the story. Berkowitz's communications increased the sense that investigators were dealing with someone who was deliberately creating a public persona. He called himself the Son of Sam. The name became attached to the entire investigation. The city changed its behavior. People became wary of parking in isolated areas. Young couples were especially concerned. The investigation became massive. Detectives gathered witness accounts. They compared descriptions. They examined ballistics. They reconstructed movements. And eventually, a seemingly minor event helped connect Berkowitz to the crimes. A parking ticket became important. Police had issued a ticket near the scene of one attack. The vehicle was connected to Berkowitz. Investigators began examining him. A police officer who had observed suspicious behavior around the scene also contributed to the identification process. Berkowitz was arrested in August 1977. The man who had generated a citywide panic was no longer an unknown figure. He was a resident of Yonkers. He worked as a postal employee. He had a normal address. The mystery had acquired a name. Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He was convicted in 1978 and sentenced to multiple life terms. His later explanations concerning demonic voices and the influence of his neighbor's dog became part of his public narrative, although these claims were heavily examined and did not provide a simple factual explanation for the crimes. The documented criminal case rested on evidence connecting Berkowitz to the shootings. The mythology surrounding the Son of Sam grew beyond that evidence. That distinction matters. True crime often creates legends around criminals. The actual investigation is usually more mundane. A license plate, a witness, a ticket, a vehicle, a timeline, a record. In Berkowitz's case, the terrifying figure who seemed almost omnipresent was eventually reduced to a man who had left behind ordinary administrative evidence. The case also demonstrated how media attention can alter a criminal investigation. Every new attack became news. Every new letter created speculation. The public knew the killer's chosen name before they knew his real one. That reversed the usual order of criminal identification. The offender created his own mythology first. Police identified the person later. Once Berkowitz was arrested, the city's fear had a physical target, but the psychological damage did not vanish immediately. The attacks had changed the way New Yorkers thought about nighttime safety. The case remains an example of how a relatively small number of crimes can produce an enormous social effect when the offender appears unpredictable. Berkowitz did not need to attack hundreds of people to create widespread fear. He needed only to convince millions that the next victim could be anyone. Number 8. H. Holmes. H. Holmes is one of the cases in this list where the historical record must be handled carefully. The popular legend surrounding Holmes is much larger than what can be established with confidence. That distinction is important. Holmes was a real criminal. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire in 1861. He became a physician and con artist. He used aliases, he engaged in fraud, he manipulated people, and he was eventually convicted of murder. But many of the stories later attached to him, especially exaggerated accounts of dozens or hundreds of murders inside a purpose-built murder castle, are not established to the same degree as the crimes for which he was prosecuted. The documented story is disturbing enough without the mythology. Holmes moved through several identities. He attended medical school and learned enough about anatomy to make medical knowledge part of his later criminal behavior. He married. He committed fraud. He used insurance schemes. He changed names. In Chicago, he acquired property and developed a building that later became famous in popular culture as the Murder Castle. The building did contain unusual features, but later retellings dramatically expanded the architecture and the number of confirmed killings. Holmes was fundamentally a confidence man. He understood how to use trust. That was more important to his crimes than any theatrical image later created around him. He lied to business associates. He manipulated financial arrangements. He used false identities. He moved between people who believed they were dealing with a legitimate professional. One of the most important documented episodes involved Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes arranged an insurance scheme involving Pitezel. The plan was supposed to involve a staged death. Instead, Pitezel actually died. Holmes then manipulated Pitezel's family and used false explanations to conceal what had happened. The investigation eventually focused on Holmes. Detectives followed financial records. They examined his movements. They interviewed associates. They discovered inconsistencies. The criminal case became increasingly difficult for Holmes to control. He was arrested in 1894. The prosecution centered on the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged in Philadelphia in 1896. The question of how many other people Holmes killed remains unresolved. Some disappearances have been associated with him. Some accusations were made. Some stories emerged after his death, but the exact number of victims cannot be established with the certainty often implied by popular accounts. That is why Holmes belongs on this list for a reason different from the one suggested by folklore. He was not remarkable because he secretly murdered hundreds of people inside a fantastical building. He was remarkable because he repeatedly used ordinary trust as a criminal instrument. He looked like a doctor. He presented himself as a businessman. He operated through contracts, property, insurance, and personal relationships. The deception was the mechanism, and deception is often harder to detect than violence. A violent offender announces danger through behavior. A con artist can conceal danger by appearing useful. Holmes understood that. He moved through a 19th century society in which record-keeping was weaker, communications were slower, and identities were easier to manipulate. By the time investigators understood the extent of his deception, the pattern had already spread across several areas of his life. His story also demonstrates why historical crime requires restraint. The most dramatic version is not necessarily the most accurate version. A responsible account must separate what Holmes was convicted of from what later writers claimed. The confirmed murder of Benjamin Pitezel is enough to establish him as a serious criminal. The fraud is documented. The manipulation is documented. The use of aliases is documented. The mythology can be left outside the evidence. That is where the real historical story becomes more unsettling. The man did not need a legendary building to deceive people. He needed people to believe him. Number 9. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal history contains one of the most disturbing failures of recognition in modern American criminal history. He had already killed multiple people before anyone understood what was happening. He had been arrested for sexual misconduct. He had displayed behavior that should have raised concern. Yet he continued living in Milwaukee. He worked, he drank, he interacted with neighbors. He maintained an outwardly quiet existence. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960 and grew up in Ohio. His childhood was marked by family instability and increasing social isolation. During adolescence, he developed disturbing fantasies. At 18, he committed his first known murder, killing Stephen Hicks in Ohio in 1978. Dahmer buried the body. He then entered military service and later moved between states. The pattern of violence did not immediately become continuous. Years passed. Then, beginning in 1987, the killings escalated. Dahmer targeted predominantly young men and boys. He often encountered them in bars or other social environments. He offered money for photographs or companionship. He brought victims to his apartment. The crimes were hidden behind an outwardly unremarkable residential life. There were warning signs. In 1988, Dahmer was convicted of sexual assault involving a 13-year-old boy. He received a prison sentence and was later released. Afterward, he returned to Milwaukee. The murders continued. One of the most disturbing episodes occurred in May 1991, when 14-year-old Konarak Synthesomphone escaped from Dahmer's apartment. Police encountered the boy. Dahmer claimed that the teenager was his intoxicated adult partner. The officers accepted the explanation and returned the boy to Dahmer. That failure became one of the most consequential moments in the case. Dahmer killed him afterward. Other victims followed. By July 1991, the hidden pattern was about to collapse. Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment with handcuffs still attached to one wrist. He encountered police. He told them that a man had attempted to restrain him. Officers returned with Edwards to Dahmer's apartment. This time, the explanation did not hold. Dahmer's behavior became suspicious. Police searched the apartment. They found photographs. They found evidence connecting him to multiple killings. The investigation expanded rapidly. Dahmer was arrested. The hidden scale of the crimes became clear. He ultimately confessed to 17 murders. The case revealed the terrible consequences of fragmented information. There had been neighbors who complained about odors. There had been a prior conviction. There had been the incident involving Konarak. There had been interactions with police. But those details had not combined into an effective intervention. The lesson is not that every warning sign automatically predicts murder. It is that warning signs have value only when institutions recognize them, share them, and act on them. Dahmer's case also became a major examination of police response and institutional failure. The officers who returned Konarak to Dahmer were heavily criticized. The event became one of the most enduring examples of what can happen when an explanation is accepted too quickly. Dahmer was tried in 1992. He was convicted of 15 murders in Wisconsin, and later received another life sentence in Ohio for the murder of Stephen Hicks. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. In November 1994, Dahmer was killed by another inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. His death ended the criminal proceedings, but it did not end the questions surrounding the case. How had 17 murders occurred without the full pattern becoming visible? Why had earlier contact with authorities not stopped him? Why did neighbors' concerns fail to produce a broader investigation? Why did one escaped victim have to create the decisive break? The answer lies partly in fragmentation. Different incidents were treated as different incidents. Different people possessed different pieces of information, and Dahmer's quiet personality made him easy to underestimate. He did not need to appear charismatic. He needed to appear harmless. That was enough. Number 10. Richard Ramirez's crimes transformed ordinary nighttime life in Southern California into a period of sustained public fear. He did not restrict himself to one victim type or one consistent method. He moved through different neighborhoods. He entered homes. He attacked people. He killed. He sexually assaulted victims. He stole. And because his behavior appeared unpredictable, residents struggled to determine what would keep them safe. Ramirez was born in Texas in 1960 and grew up in El Paso. His adolescence included exposure to violence and disturbing influences, including an older cousin who had served in Vietnam and later showed him graphic images of wartime violence. Ramirez also developed a fascination with Satanism and heavy metal culture. Those details became part of the later narrative, but they should not be treated as a simple explanation for his crimes. The documented criminal trajectory is more important. Ramirez moved to California. In 1984, he committed his first known murder in Los Angeles County. Over the next year, his attacks increased. He entered homes at night. Victims were sometimes asleep. He used different weapons. He attacked people of different ages. The lack of a consistent victim profile made the investigation more difficult. There was no single demographic category that could explain the attacks. The offender's unpredictability became part of the fear. The media gave him the name Night Stalker. Police released information. Witnesses provided descriptions. Investigators gathered physical evidence. The offender left fingerprints and other clues. One of the most important breakthroughs involved a stolen vehicle. A woman witnessed the vehicle connected to Ramirez and provided information that helped investigators. Authorities eventually released photographs and fingerprints to the public. Once his image became widely known, the case changed. Ramirez was no longer an unidentified figure. He had a face. The public recognized him. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles. He was recognized by residents. A crowd pursued him. He was beaten and restrained until police arrived. The dramatic arrest ended the immediate threat. But the prosecution that followed would last for years. Ramirez was charged with 13 murders, among numerous other offenses. His trial began in 1988. The evidence included eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and physical links between Ramirez and several crimes. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to death. California's death penalty system kept him on death row for decades. Ramirez died in 2013 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma while awaiting execution. His case illustrates the difference between public fear and investigative certainty. For residents, the Night Stalker seemed almost impossible to predict. For investigators, the task was to convert apparently unrelated attacks into one evidence chain. Every crime supplied another fragment, a fingerprint, a witness, a vehicle, a description, a piece of physical evidence, a timeline. The eventual identification did not come from one miraculous discovery. It emerged from accumulation. And once Ramirez's identity was public, the power of anonymity disappeared. The most important moment in the case was therefore not simply his capture. It was the moment the unknown offender became recognizable. Before that, people were afraid of a figure. After it, police were searching for a person. That distinction changed everything, and it reveals one of the recurring realities of criminal investigation. A perpetrator can seem almost everywhere while remaining unidentified. Then one piece of evidence gives the pattern a name. Once that happens, the case begins to close. The crimes of these 10 offenders were very different. Some relied on deception. Some relied on isolation. Some moved between jurisdictions. Some cultivated respectable identities. Some communicated with investigators. Some remained silent. Some were identified quickly. Others remained unidentified for decades. But the common thread is not that police were incompetent, or that these criminals were somehow beyond detection. The deeper pattern is more uncomfortable. Before a crime happens, evidence is scattered. Afterward, evidence is connected. A hotel booking can look ordinary. A business can look legitimate. A church membership can look reassuring. A computer disk can look insignificant. A license plate can look like paperwork. A DNA profile can sit unidentified for decades. A missing persons report can appear isolated. A suspicious neighbor complaint can remain just that, suspicious. The criminal often exists inside those ordinary details. The investigator sees the meaning only after the details begin to converge. That is what makes cases like these so difficult to forget. The warning signs, when reconstructed afterward, can seem obvious, but history is built from what people knew at the time. And at the time, the picture was incomplete. For Stephen Paddock, investigators ultimately found no single clear motive and concluded that he acted alone. For Joseph DeAngelo, the biological evidence survived long enough for technology to identify him decades later. For Dennis Rader, the desire to communicate became the opening investigators needed. For Ted Kaczynski, language connected an anonymous bomber to a specific man. For John Wayne Gacy, one missing teenager's connection to a contractor exposed a hidden crime scene. For Jeffrey Dahmer, one survivor finally brought police inside the apartment. Different cases, different criminals, different failures. But the same uncomfortable principle remains. Criminal investigations rarely unfold with the clarity of hindsight. They unfold through fragments, and sometimes the fragment that finally solves the case is the one nobody knew mattered until everything else had already happened.